No one expected the dog to lunge. Not in a courthouse, not in front of a judge, a mother, and her wide-eyed daughter. But in a split second, Shadow broke the silence, with a deep, warning growl that froze the entire hallway. Officer Kyle Bennett had worked courthouse security for years, seen his share of family disputes, custody battles, the occasional outburst. But this wasn't normal. Shadow, his canine partner, was trained not just for detection, but to read stress, to sense danger where humans couldn't. And right now, Shadow's body was stiff as a board, hackles raised, blocking the main exit with every ounce of his 90-pound frame. The woman in front of them, well-dressed, composed, late 30s, blinked in confusion. "Excuse me," she said, her voice soft but strained. "We're just trying to leave." Kyle stepped in closer, keeping his hand on Shadow's harness. "Ma'am, I'm going to need you to pause right there." The little girl beside her said nothing. Maybe 6 years old, pale, tiny, clutching a stuffed bunny like it was the only safe thing in the world. She didn't look at Kyle. She didn't look at the dog. She looked at the floor. The woman gave a tight smile. "It's just a dog. Probably doesn't like my perfume." Kyle didn't respond. He looked down at Shadow, who hadn't moved an inch. His jaw was clenched, ears forward, eyes locked onto the woman's waist, not her face. This was no perfume thing. The hallway had mostly cleared after the custody hearing. Judge Monroe had stepped back into chambers, and the bailiff was wrapping up paperwork. But Kyle's instincts had started prickling the moment the woman walked out of the courtroom holding that girl's hand. She didn't glance around like most parents, didn't even acknowledge her daughter. Just moved fast, too fast, straight toward the exit. Shadow had never blocked a child or parent in 5 years of courthouse work, not once. Now he was rooted to the floor like a statue, unmoving, unflinching. The growl rumbled again, low and steady, a sound that meant one thing to Kyle. Danger isn't what it seems. "Ma'am," Kyle said, voice firmer, "I'm going to ask you to step aside for a moment. We're not detaining you, just need to clarify something." The woman's expression didn't change, but her hand squeezed the girl's tighter. "This is ridiculous. I've just been granted temporary custody. I have court documents. You can't just—" "I understand," Kyle nodded calmly. "Please step into the adjacent family room. It'll only take a minute." She hesitated. Shadow's growl deepened. The girl flinched. That was enough. Kyle pressed the radio clip to his vest. "Bailiff, can you meet me at Corridor C? Possible issue with post-hearing custody handoff." Inside the family room, the mood was tense. Neutral walls, plastic chairs, bright overhead lighting that made everything feel more sterile than safe. Kyle kept Shadow at the door while child advocate Dana Rollins was called in. Dana was one of the best, empathetic, no nonsense, and trusted by kids across the county. She entered with a gentle smile, crouching beside the little girl, while the woman waited on the far side of the room, arms crossed. "What's your bunny's name?" Dana asked softly. The girl didn't answer, just hugged it tighter. The woman interjected sharply, "She's shy around strangers. We've had a long day." Kyle stayed quiet, observing. His gut told him something was off. Not just Shadow's reaction, though that alone was enough to halt any normal release, but the girl's silence, the stiffness, the way she never looked to the woman for comfort, even now. Dana asked if she could speak to the child privately. The woman reluctantly agreed. Kyle escorted her just outside the door, where another officer waited. Inside, Dana kneeled again. "It's okay, sweetheart. You're safe now. My name's Dana. I help kids who've had to go to court." Still no reply. Dana glanced at Kyle and mouthed trauma response. But then the girl's thumb moved. She traced something along the bunny's paw. Dana leaned closer and her eyes widened. Tiny letters had been scratched faintly into the fabric, barely visible, but clear. H-E-L-P. Kyle's breath caught. He stepped into the hall. "Ma'am," he said to the woman, "we're going to ask you to stay for a few additional minutes while we verify your custody documents. It's standard after-hour protocol." "I've already been cleared," she snapped. "This is harassment." Kyle smiled thinly. "It's procedure." The woman muttered something under her breath, then pulled out her phone. Shadow's eyes followed every movement. He barked, loud, not a warning bark. "An alert!" Kyle moved instantly. "Put the phone down." "Excuse me?" "Now!" She froze, then slowly placed it on the bench. Kyle picked it up with gloves. The screen was open to an encrypted messaging app. Recent message sent. "Gooder, ETA 15 minutes." That wasn't a message to a friend. That was coordination. Kyle felt a chill run down his spine. He turned to his radio again. "Possible code Amber. Repeat. Possible code Amber. Need Homeland Liaison and CPS backup immediately." Back inside the room, Dana had finally gotten the girl to speak. Just one sentence. "I want to go home," she whispered. Kyle knelt beside her. "Where's home, honey?" She shook her head, then said, almost too softly, "Not with her." The woman was now restrained in a holding room. Kyle watched from the monitor as she sat stone-faced, refusing to answer questions. Her ID had checked out. Her adoption documents. Clean. Too clean. Shadow sat next to the little girl on the bench. Calm now. Watching. Guarding. And when she reached out to touch his ear, just barely, Shadow turned his head and gently nuzzled her hand. For the first time she smiled. A tired, broken smile. But it was real. Kyle stood there quietly, one hand resting on the canine's harness, his heart pounding with questions that no longer had simple answers. Something was very wrong here, and Shadow had known it from the start. The silence in the interview room was thicker than the air conditioning that hummed overhead. Officer Kyle Bennett leaned against the wall, arms folded, eyes locked on the woman behind the glass. Her name, at least the name on her documents, was Rachel Moore, and according to everything the system had on file, she was squeaky clean. Too squeaky. Her ID was real. Her paperwork, court-approved temporary guardianship, looked legitimate. The judge had signed off on it, believing it was an out-of-state adoption transfer. But the more Kyle looked at her, the more something didn't sit right. It wasn't just Shadow's reaction anymore. It was the girl's body language, the silence, the way her tiny hand had trembled as she gripped that worn-out bunny. And now that scrawled word, "help," stitched into the fabric. Kyle turned toward the other room where the little girl sat with child advocate Dana Rollins. Shadow lay at her feet like a furry sentry, eyes half closed but always alert. She hadn't spoken much since whispering she wanted to go home, but she hadn't said where home was, or who was waiting there, or why she didn't want to go with the woman who claimed to be her mother. Kyle glanced at his watch. CPS and Homeland Security were on their way, but time felt slippery. Too many unknowns, too many cracks in the story. In the child support room, Dana was slowly building trust, minute by minute, word by word. She handed the girl a juice box and opened one herself, sipping slowly like it was a normal afternoon, not a potential child trafficking investigation. "You did really good in court today," Dana said softly. "That's a big, brave thing you did." The girl gave a barely there nod. Dana smiled. "Shadow likes brave kids. That's why he picked you to protect." At that, the girl's eyes moved, just slightly, toward the dog, then back down. "What's your bunny's name?" Dana asked again gently. The girl whispered something too soft to hear. Dana leaned in. "Peach," the girl said, eyes still down. Dana smiled. "That's a great name. Did your mommy give it to you?" A pause, then the girl whispered, "Not her." Dana's heart skipped. She didn't press, just made a mental note. "Do you remember what your mommy used to call you?" she asked. The girl's eyes filled with something unspoken. She hugged Peach closer. Dana glanced toward Kyle through the window, and they exchanged a look that needed no words. Meanwhile, Kyle pulled up every angle he could find on Rachel Moore. There were no social media accounts, no digital footprint until 2 years ago. That wasn't unheard of, especially for someone trying to avoid an abusive partner or start fresh. But it was the pattern that bothered him. She'd moved 3 times across 3 states in 18 months, always to mid-sized cities, always renting short-term, always working with small family law firms that handled custody and adoption cases. And in each of those counties, missing children reports, girls between ages 5 and 7. 2 still open, 1 cold. Kyle clicked through the images. Blurry, low-res, different hair lengths, different clothes. But one face made his stomach tighten. The eyes, the cheekbones. He printed it and walked straight to the child room. "Dana," he said quietly, handing her the page. She glanced at it and knelt beside the girl again. "Sweetheart, does this look like you?" The girl's lip quivered. She nodded slowly. Kyle's jaw tightened. The judge's chambers were tense as Kyle and Deputy Fields laid out the findings. "It's not conclusive," the deputy warned. "We don't have DNA confirmation yet." "I'm aware," Judge Monroe said, reading the printed reports. "But if that's the same girl, she's been missing out of Georgia for nearly a year and a half." Kyle added, "And if that's true, that woman isn't her legal guardian, she's someone else entirely." "Trafficker?" the judge asked. "We don't know yet," Kyle said, "but she's too calm, too prepared. My guess? This isn't her first attempt." The judge leaned back. "Hold her, no bail, get Homeland on the line, and thank that dog of yours." Kyle gave a slight nod. Back in the observation room, Shadow sat tall, eyes on the door. When it opened and the woman, Rachel, was led past, the dog growled again. Not out of fear or aggression, It was instinct, that primal response to danger that no human training could mimic. The girl shrank back as Rachel passed, but this time she reached for Shadow. She gripped his ear, holding on like it was a lifeline. Rachel paused just slightly, enough for Kyle to see it, the flicker of recognition, not of a mother, but of someone who'd just lost control of her prize. Then she kept walking, stone-faced. That night, Kyle stayed late at the station, typing up his report while Shadow dozed at his feet. He couldn't shake this moment, that small hand reaching for Shadow's fur, that coded cry for help hidden inside a toy, that quiet whisper, "Not her." He thought about his own daughters, how they used to cling to his pant leg when they were scared, how they slept with stuffed animals long after they said they didn't need them. And he thought about the girls who didn't get to sleep in safe beds, who were passed around like currency, who weren't believed when they said something was wrong. That little girl, she hadn't screamed, hadn't fought. She'd just gone silent, because silence was how she survived. An email pinged on his laptop, DNA expedited, results due within 24 hours. Kyle shut it down, packed up, and gave Shadow a scratch behind the ears. "Good work today, bud." The dog let out a small huff and wagged his tail once before following him out. Outside, the air was cool, quiet. But Kyle knew things weren't really quiet, not beneath the surface. Something was unraveling, and Shadow had just tugged the first thread. The next morning came too early. Officer Kyle Bennett parked his cruiser outside the courthouse annex, coffee in hand, exhaustion etched under his eyes. He hadn't slept much, not with everything from yesterday playing on repeat in his head. The little girl, the fake mother, Shadow's unshakable instincts. He glanced over at his partner in the passenger seat. Shadow was alert, ears perked, staring through the windshield like he was still working the case in his head too. "Ready to go in?" Kyle asked. Shadow gave a small grunt, tail tapping the seat once. Kyle smiled and stepped out. Inside, the mood was different today. More guarded, quieter. Word had spread through the courthouse staff about the woman with the girl and the dog that wouldn't let them leave. Of course, most didn't know the full story. They weren't supposed to, not yet. Dana Rollins, the child advocate, was already there, seated beside the girl in a softly lit waiting room. The child, still not confirmed by name, wore a fresh set of clothes someone from Child Services had picked up from Target that morning. Pink sweatshirt, purple leggings. Her bunny, Peach, rested on her lap. When she saw Shadow walk in, her face shifted slightly. Not quite a smile, not yet, but something like recognition, like safety. Shadow approached slowly, then settled by her feet, his body curled like a warm wall around her. Kyle looked to Dana. "How's she doing?" Dana exhaled, slept in short bursts, ate some cereal, still very quiet, but she asked if Shadow would come back. "That's something." Kyle crouched beside the girl. "Hey, kiddo, remember me?" She nodded faintly. "I'm Officer Bennett. You can call me Kyle if you want. And this big guy, he's my partner, Shadow." Another nod. Kyle kept his voice light. "You like pancakes?" This time, a tiny smile. "We'll see what we can do after all this." In the adjacent room, CPS agents were reviewing the adoption documents again. They had already flagged one major issue: the judge who approved the temporary guardianship in Arizona. Al Asir, where Rachel Moore had claimed to live, had died 6 months before the document was supposedly signed. Forged signature, false jurisdiction, fake notary. The adoption trail was unraveling fast. Kyle joined them, files in hand. "There's something else," he said, laying down a printed photo. "This girl, missing from a shelter in Savannah, Georgia last March. She matches our Jane Doe almost exactly. Only difference is the hair color, but that could have been dyed." The lead agent nodded. "We've already contacted the Savannah PD. The mother's name was Carla, real mom, reported her missing after a failed custody handoff. The case went cold when Carla passed away 3 months later in a car accident." Kyle felt his stomach twist. "So if this is her," he said, "there's no one left looking for her." Until Shadow started barking. Later that afternoon, the little girl was taken to a child-safe medical unit for a standard wellness check and DNA swab. Kyle drove her personally with Shadow in the back seat beside her. She didn't say much, but at one point, halfway through the drive, she reached over the center console and lightly touched Kyle's hand. Then just as quickly, she pulled back and returned to hugging her bunny. Kyle didn't say anything. He didn't need to. That was the first time she had willingly touched another human since they'd met. Shadow looked up at him in the rearview mirror, ears tilted forward. At the medical center, while the doctor ran the swabs and logged the girl's vitals, Kyle stood in the hallway, flipping through his notebook. It wasn't just about this girl anymore. Rachel Moore, or whoever she really was, had made her way through at least 3 states. If she wasn't working alone, she was part of something bigger. And something Kyle had seen before. 3 years ago, back in Dallas, Shadow had stopped another child from being taken. The girl had been drugged and passed off as someone's niece. Shadow hadn't growled then. He just refused to get in the car. At the time, Kyle thought it was just canine intuition. Now he knew better. These dogs, they didn't just sniff bombs or drugs. They picked up on fear, on deception. They reacted when something didn't feel right. And that instinct had saved more lives than Kyle could count. Back at the courthouse, Kyle pulled up surveillance footage of Rachel Moore from the last few days. There she was, moving with confidence, filing paperwork, smiling for the clerk, holding the girl's hand like it was second nature. But there was no warmth in her gestures, no eye contact with the child, no nurturing, even in private moments. It was clinical, precise, like a transaction. He paused the video and zoomed in. A moment when the girl had tried to sit, tired, and Rachel had yanked her upright without breaking stride. Kyle clenched his jaw. This wasn't neglect. This was control. Later that night, back at the station, Kyle sat with the girl in the quiet interview room. No pressure, no bright lights, just soft lamps and a few toys on the floor. He slid a coloring book across the table. "Ever do one of these?" he asked. She nodded and reached for a crayon. "Purple." He let her color for a while before asking gently, "Do you remember the place you lived before her?" A pause, then a small voice. "There were trees." "Big trees?" She nodded. "Was there a park?" Another nod. "Was there anyone who sang to you, maybe a song at bedtime?" This time her lip trembled. "My real mommy." "What did she sing?" The girl closed her eyes and hummed a faint tune. Kyle recognized it. "You Are My Sunshine." He smiled. "My mom used to sing that too." Then the girl opened her eyes and said something that chilled him to the bone. "She told me to remember it, so I wouldn't forget who I was." Kyle swallowed hard. "You haven't forgotten." She looked at him, and for the first time really looked. The next morning, the DNA results came in. Positive match. She was the missing girl from Savannah. Her name was Emily Rhodes, age 6, daughter of Carla Rhodes, now deceased. There were no other living family members on record. She was legally a ward of the state now. But she wasn't nameless. She wasn't invisible. She wasn't alone. Kyle held the report in one hand, Shadow's leash in the other. "We got her, boy," he whispered. "You did it again." Shadow let out a soft breath and leaned his head against Kyle's hip. When Officer Kyle Bennett walked into the precinct just after sunrise, the world outside was still cloaked in fog. Autumn had finally settled over the city, and the streets shimmered with dew and soft golden light. Inside the station, though, things were anything but calm. The case had already reached Homeland Security. 2 agents had flown in overnight. A formal task force was in motion, built not just around Rachel Moore, but the possibility of an organized trafficking ring operating under the guise of family court transfers and private adoptions. Kyle walked down the corridor with 2 coffees in hand. One was for Dana, who sat curled in a corner chair, cross-referencing family court records. The other was for himself. Shadow padded quietly beside him. They reached the interview wing where Emily sat, cross-legged on a soft rug, coloring. A child services staffer sat nearby, keeping her company but giving her space. Shadow immediately walked over and settled next to her. She didn't even look up, just rested her small hand on his back. It was a ritual now. Kyle watched for a moment, heart heavy with everything they still didn't know. She was 6 years old. She'd been missing for over a year. Her mother had died trying to find her. And if Shadow hadn't stopped that woman from leaving the courthouse, she would have disappeared again. Maybe forever. Dana stood and stretched, accepting the coffee. "Any word on Rachel?" Kyle shook his head, still holding to her story. "She wants a lawyer, refuses to give us her real name. Homeland's trying facial recognition now." "And the phone?" Dana asked. "Encrypted. It's working on it, but she deleted most of it before we stopped her." Dana sighed. She knew exactly what she was doing. Kyle looked through the glass at Emily. She wasn't working alone. Dana nodded slowly. They never are. By mid-morning, one of the Homeland agents pulled Kyle into the conference room. "We got a hit," Agent Sloan said, tapping her laptop. "Rachel Moore is an alias. Real name's Erica Voss, born in Connecticut. Used over a dozen identities in the past 8 years. She's been on our watch list for suspected child relocation fraud. Basically trafficking through manipulated family court systems." Kyle leaned over her shoulder. The files went back nearly a decade. Fake adoptions, suspicious disappearances, falsified court documents. She always keeps it just clean enough, Sloan said. Uses real lawyers, real notaries, then vanishes before anything catches up. Her latest trick is using legitimate courtrooms as exit points. Clean paperwork, clean kid, no red flags, unless a dog decides to bark. Kyle exhaled. Shadow's the reason we caught her. Sloan smiled. I read the report. That's not just a good dog, that's a damn hero. Later that day, Kyle sat down with Dana to review the timeline. She filed for guardianship in Arizona under the name Rachel Moore, Dana said. The judge's signature was forged. Then she came here 2 weeks ago, showed up with Emily, claimed she was newly relocated, handed over documentation, but never filed for full adoption. Why not? Kyle asked. My guess? Dana flipped the page. She was already prepping the next phase, selling the kid, trading, whatever she was planning. It didn't involve staying. Kyle's stomach turned. Any indication of where she got Emily from? Dana shook her head. That part's still missing. Kyle looked down at Shadow, who sat patiently at his feet. She didn't get Emily willingly, he said quietly. That girl's been scared since the second I met her. She wasn't rescued. She was taken. Back in the safe room, Emily was finally talking. Not much, but enough. Dana sat beside her, keeping the question soft, slow. Do you remember how long you were with Erica? She asked gently. Emily shrugged. I don't know. That's okay. Do you remember where you stayed? Emily drew a crooked square on her paper. The yellow house. It had no stairs, just one floor. Dana nodded. Did anyone else live there? A man. Do you know his name? Emily paused, crayon frozen midair. He had a snake on his neck. Dana blinked. A tattoo? Emily nodded. Kyle, listening from the doorway, made a note. Kyle brought in Deputy Fields later that evening. If we can identify the man, Kyle said, we might get the rest of the network. Tattooed snake on the neck isn't exactly subtle, Fields muttered. We'll run local databases. They fed the information into the system, searching mugshots, probation records, anything tied to a serpent tattoo. At 9:14 p.m. a hit came back. Mason Krill, 42, flagged for child endangerment 6 years ago in Nevada. Charges were dropped, but he disappeared soon after. Last known address, Phoenix, Arizona. Kyle stared at the screen. That was where Erica, Rachel, had filed her fake custody order, and Mason had been listed as an independent witness on the notarized form. They had their connection. By the next morning, a search warrant was issued for a rural property just outside Flagstaff. Kyle wasn't part of the raid team, but he followed the reports closely. The house was abandoned when agents arrived. No sign of Erica's belongings, no trace of children. But inside, they found hidden compartments behind the walls, filled with ID printers, court seal stamps, and forged documentation. One room had toys, old ones, scattered, dusty, a makeshift bed with pink sheets and a missing headboard. Shadow stared at the photos Kyle spread on his desk. Emily had lived there. Back at the courthouse, Emily was finally opening up to Kyle, not through words exactly, but through drawings. She slid one across the table. It was a crayon sketch of a woman with yellow hair and a man with a snake on his neck. Between them was a little girl holding a bunny. I think this is you, Kyle said softly. Emily nodded. Did they ever hurt you? She hesitated, then whispered, she said if I ran, I'd never find my mommy again. Kyle's heart broke. He wanted to explain that her mother was gone, that the world she'd once known had changed, but he didn't. He reached over, gently patting Shadow's head. She was wrong, he said. You were found, and we're not letting anyone take you again. That night, as Kyle drove Emily to her temporary foster home, she fell asleep in the back seat with Shadow curled around her. The house was quiet, run by a kind older woman named Mrs. Jennings who fostered no more than 2 children at a time. Emily didn't cry when she was carried inside. She didn't speak. But when Shadow turned to leave, she sat up suddenly and whispered, Can he come back tomorrow? Kyle looked at Mrs. Jennings, who smiled. Of course, she said, he's welcome anytime. As Kyle drove away, he glanced in the mirror at the courthouse tower disappearing behind the trees. He thought about Erica Voss, about the other children, about the documents they hadn't yet found, the cases that were still open, the parents still searching. But he also thought about Emily's hand on Shadow's fur, her whisper, her courage. And he thought about the T who had stood in front of the courthouse exit, not with his teeth, but with his heart, and said no one else leaves with her. Not today, not on his watch. The email came through at 6:42 a.m. sharp. Subject, DNA confirmation, Rhodes case. Officer Kyle Bennett stared at the screen in silence. He hadn't even taken a sip of his coffee yet, but the adrenaline shot through him like a switch had been flipped. Positive match. Emily Rhodes, 6 years old, daughter of Carla Rhodes, deceased. No other familial matches in the National Registry. No siblings, no aunts, no living father. She was, legally and biologically, alone in the world. And yet, for over a year, she hadn't been. She'd been owned by someone who pretended to be her family, and nearly got away with it. Kyle grabbed his jacket and called Dana on the way out the door. DNA confirms it, he said as he pulled out of his driveway. She's Emily. She's the missing girl from Savannah. I'll notify Homeland, Dana said, and I'll head to the foster home to tell her gently. I'm 10 minutes out. Let me be the one to tell her. Mrs. Jennings greeted Kyle with a warm nod and a soft smile. She's still sleeping, she whispered. Shadow can go up if he wants. She left a spot for him on the bed. Kyle laughed softly. He probably planned it that way. Upstairs, Shadow's nails clicked gently across the wood floor as they reached Emily's room. The door was cracked open. Inside, light filtered through pink curtains, painting everything in soft morning hues. Emily was curled in bed, one arm slung around Peach the bunny, the other draped across a crumpled drawing. Shadow let out a soft chuff. Emily stirred. When her eyes opened and saw them, she smiled without hesitation. You came back. Kyle nodded. Told you we would. She sat up slowly, rubbing her eyes. Did you find my mommy? Kyle walked over and crouched beside the bed. Emily, your mommy loved you very, very much. She tried really hard to find you, but she had an accident and she's not here anymore. Emily didn't cry. Not right away. She just stared, still waking, still processing. Then she looked down at Peach, pulled her close, and whispered something Kyle couldn't hear. Shadow stepped forward, pressing his head gently against her arm. That's when the tears came. Quiet, sincere, like a dam slowly opening. And Kyle let her cry, because grief had no age limit. At the precinct, Erica Voss, formerly Rachel Moore, sat handcuffed in an interrogation room with 2 Homeland agents and an assistant district attorney. Her face was emotionless, her hands steady. But the walls were closing in. They now had her true name, birth records, and outstanding warrants. They had traced her last 3 false adoption filings, each in a different state, each linked to missing minors. 2 of those children were still unaccounted for. Kyle joined the observation team on the other side of the glass, sipping coffee that had long gone cold. She hasn't said a word since we showed her the DNA results, one of the agents muttered. Kyle leaned closer to the mic. Let me in there. The lead agent raised an eyebrow. You're not on the task force. I'm the reason she's here, Kyle said evenly. Let me talk to her. They hesitated, then opened the door. Erica looked up as Kyle entered. I remember you, she said, voice smooth, almost amused. The one with the dog. Kyle sat down across from her, calm, focused. We confirmed the girl's identity, he said. She's Emily Rhodes. Her real mother died looking for her. Erica didn't flinch. Tragic. Is that all you have to say? She smiled faintly. You're trying to rattle me, but I don't rattle. Kyle leaned in, voice low. Then explain this. Why a courthouse? Why fake adoption papers? Why choose public systems that leave paper trails? She tilted her head. Because the best place to hide is in plain sight. Kyle felt his jaw tighten. You don't strike me as a rookie, she continued. So let's not pretend you don't understand how broken the system is. Children fall through the cracks every day. I just make sure they land somewhere profitable. Kyle stood. You're done. She smiled wider. Not even close. Outside the room, Agent Sloan met Kyle with a tight expression. She's not going to crack, the agent said. But the paper trail is enough. She'll never see daylight again. What about the others? Kyle asked. We found references to 2 more children in her encrypted notes, she replied. But no names, no photos, just initials and transaction IDs. We'll need to trace financials and hope to God the kids are still alive. Kyle nodded grimly. Start with the tattoo guy, he said, Mason Krill. If she worked with him once, odds are he's part of the trade network. He vanished off radar last week, Sloan added, but we've put out a nationwide alert. That afternoon, Dana met Kyle in the station lobby, her face unreadable. She asked me today if she could be adopted, Dana said. Kyle blinked. Already? Dana nodded. She didn't mean legally, not yet. She just wanted to know if there were people who pick kids. Pick them for keeps, she said. Kyle ran a hand through his hair. She doesn't trust permanence. No, Dana replied, but she wants to. They sat in silence for a moment. She sleeps better when Shadow's there, Dana added quietly. Kyle looked down at his partner, who sat by the front doors, tongue lolling, completely unaware of the emotional war his presence helped win. That night, Kyle went home and sat in his kitchen longer than usual. He stared at his phone, scrolling through photos of Emily, her coloring book pages, her quiet smile, the way she clung to Shadow's fur like it was a rope in a storm. She deserved more than temporary solutions. He thought about calling his sister, a family lawyer in Oregon. He thought about asking what the process looked like for fostering, for something more. But he wasn't ready yet. Still, the seed had been planted. Meanwhile, across the city, a fire broke out in a small storage unit. Investigators wouldn't know until morning that the unit was rented under one of Erica's aliases. Inside, half-melted documents, a charred hard drive, a single unburned photo, 2 children, 1 girl, 1 boy standing in front of a nondescript trailer. Neither one was Emily. Kyle would see that photo 2 days later and realize this story wasn't over. Not even close. The flames had barely finished smoldering by the time Kyle Bennett arrived at the scene. The storage facility, just outside city limits, sat in a haze of melted plastic and scorched concrete. Fire crews were already wrapping up, and the forensics team from Homeland Security was sweeping through the rubble. The unit that burned had been rented under the name Sarah Givens, yet another of Erica Voss's many aliases. What caught everyone off guard wasn't the hard drive, melted beyond recovery, or the destroyed papers. It was the single untouched photograph tucked into a fireproof envelope behind a false wall. 2 children, a boy and a girl, standing in front of a plain aluminum trailer. Neither one was Emily. Kyle stared at it for a long time. These weren't just victims. They were next. Back at the precinct, the investigation was now operating under a joint task force label. Operation Safe Crossings. Homeland, FBI, CPS, local law enforcement. And somewhere in the middle of it, Kyle and Shadow. Emily had become a symbol, though no one said it out loud. Her rescue, her silence, her slow return to trust. It was the human face of something much darker than anyone had expected. A child almost lost to a system that had no idea how badly it had been manipulated. "Who are they?" Dana asked, holding the photo between her gloved fingers. Kyle shook his head. "Not in any database yet. Facial recognition's running, but nothing so far. Could be off-the-grid kids. Could be international." Dana looked weary. "If Erica hadn't been caught when she would have disappeared again," Kyle said, "and taken others with her." Dana looked over at Shadow, who was stretched out on the precinct floor beside Emily. "She's still asking for him every night." Kyle gave a soft smile. "She's got good taste." That evening, Kyle stopped by Mrs. Jennings' house to drop off a few supplies. Emily's favorite yogurt, a new toothbrush with cartoon dogs, and a fleece blanket she had admired earlier that week. Shadow, of course, led the way inside like he lived there. Emily was coloring in the living room. When she saw them, she lit up, not with the full, carefree joy of a typical 6-year-old, but with a quiet beam that said, "I remember you. You came back again." She ran to Shadow, wrapping her arms around his neck. Kyle crouched beside her. "Hey, superstar. I heard you helped Dana remember the words to You Are My Sunshine. That true?" Emily giggled softly. "I brought you something," Kyle said, pulling the blanket from the bag. She touched it gently, running her fingers over the soft fabric. "Is it mine?" "All yours," he said, "and even has paw prints on it." Shadow barked once in approval. Emily held the blanket up to her chest, and for a moment, Kyle thought she might cry. But she didn't. She just whispered, "Thank you," and buried her face in Shadow's fur. Meanwhile, the task force had uncovered something bigger. 2 more children, both missing from foster placements in Utah and Florida, had been traced to fake adoptions filed by the same notary Erica had used. Both filings occurred within a year of each other. Different names, different states, but the same signature and stamp. One of the kids, a girl named Rosalie, had vanished at age 7. She would be 10 now. The boy, Jaden, had disappeared the same year as Emily. Both children were last seen with women who resembled Erica's basic profile. Mid-30s, composed, maternal, but never the same exact face. The operation, it seemed, was far more organized than anyone had feared. Kyle sat through briefings, read files, studied patterns, but his mind kept drifting back to Emily. The way she now said goodnight without being asked, the way she followed Shadow like a little sister. And then there was the moment she called him Mr. Kyle for the first time. Not officer, not sir, just Mr. Kyle. Soft, curious, safe. That name didn't carry rank. It carried trust. That weekend, Kyle sat on his porch with his sister on speakerphone. "Let me get this straight," she said. "You're asking me what it would take to foster a 6-year-old?" Kyle exhaled. "I'm just asking questions." Uh-huh. Does this 6-year-old have a name? He hesitated. Emily. There was a pause on the line. Then, is this about the courthouse case? The one in the news? Yeah. Is she okay? She's holding together, Kyle said. Better than most adults would. Another pause. And you? I don't know, he admitted. I can't stop thinking about her. Not in some savior way, just like she deserves more than limbo. And I keep wondering if I'm supposed to be part of her story. His sister spoke gently. Kyle, you'd be amazing, but this isn't about fixing her. It's about walking with her. Kyle smiled. Yeah, I think I get that. I'll send you the paperwork, and she said, just look it over. No pressure. The next day, Kyle took Emily and Shadow to the police K-9 training center. Just for fun, just for something normal. He didn't put her in the main field. That was too intense. Instead, he let her watch Shadow run a basic scent trail course while she clapped from the sidelines, bouncing on her toes like it was the Super Bowl. When he returned, panting and triumphant, she knelt beside him. I think he has superhero powers, she whispered. Kyle winked. He does. You want to try something? She hesitated, then nodded. He handed her one of Shadow's toys. Hide this somewhere while I close my eyes. She tucked it under a bench and giggled as she ran back. Okay, boy, Kyle said. Find it. Shadow sniffed the air once and trotted off confidently. 30 seconds later, he returned with the toy in his mouth. Emily squealed in delight. It was the first time Kyle had ever heard her really laugh. That night, Kyle sat at his desk, staring at the foster paperwork his sister had emailed. He hadn't signed anything yet, but he had highlighted every line. Shadow lay nearby, twitching in his sleep. And down the hall, Emily slept under her paw print blanket in a room that was no longer temporary. The courthouse was different now. The usual buzz of hurried footsteps and rustling papers still echoed through the marble halls, but something had shifted since Shadow blocked that exit a few weeks back. People walked a little slower past security. They glanced at the K-9 unit a little longer. And when kids were brought in to testify or sit through hearings, there was now a new rule. If Shadow was on duty, he got to sit with them. No one argued with it, especially not the judge. Emily walked in that morning in a yellow dress and tiny pink sneakers, her hair tied back in 2 loose braids. She held Kyle's hand in one and Shadow's leash in the other. The leash was just for show. Really, Shadow didn't need it with her. They made their way through the lobby, past clerks who smiled warmly, and guards who gave Shadow discreet head pats as he passed. Inside Judge Monroe's chambers, the mood was calm. Dana was already seated, along with Mrs. Jennings and a representative from Child Services. And in Kyle's jacket pocket sat the document he hadn't been able to stop thinking about since the day it landed in his inbox. Foster placement application, Bershon, emergency and long-term consideration child, Emily Rhodes. Judge Monroe adjusted his glasses. So, Emily, he said warmly, I hear you've made quite the impression on the whole building. Emily smiled shyly. Shadow rested his head on her foot. Do you know why we're here today? Dana asked gently. Emily looked at Kyle, then back to the judge. Because I have a home now, she said, quiet but clear. The day Erica Voss was sentenced, the courtroom was packed. Homeland had recommended maximum federal charges: trafficking, fraud, conspiracy, identity theft. Her defense team barely fought it. There was too much evidence, too many names, too many children. She never looked at Kyle, never looked at Emily, just stared straight ahead as the judge read the sentence, 40 years without parole. In the hallway afterward, the parents of other victims approached Kyle quietly. One hugged him, one just nodded, tearfully. But the moment that stayed with him happened outside, near the courthouse steps. A boy, maybe 12, walked up beside Emily, his foster parents trailing behind. You were the girl from the news, right? He asked. Emily froze. Kyle bent down beside her. It's okay, you can talk if you want. Emily looked at the boy. Were you there too? He nodded. In the trailer. Emily stepped forward and reached out her pinky. He stared at it, then hooked his pinky with hers. No words exchanged. Just that quiet bond between survivors. Weeks passed. Emily started attending school 2 days a week part-time. The rest of her education was at home, or with Mrs. Jennings, or with Kyle on the station lawn, learning about K-9 units and watching Shadow go through drills. She started smiling more, laughing louder, eating meals without checking over her shoulder. And every night she still asked the same question. Is Shadow sleeping here? Every night the answer was yes. One evening while they sat on the back porch watching the sunset melt into the tree line, Kyle cleared his throat. You know, he said casually, I turned in that foster form. Emily looked up. You did? He nodded. Means I get to keep an eye on you a little longer, if that's okay. She didn't answer right away. Instead, she stood up, walked over, and wrapped her arms around his waist. Kyle hadn't realized how badly he needed that hug until the moment it happened. Shadow stood and rested his head gently against them both. The following week, the city held a public ceremony on the courthouse lawn. Dozens gathered, judges, officers, citizens, survivors. It wasn't just about Erica's sentencing, it was about what came next, about healing, and about honoring the dog who started it all. They called him to the stage, Canine Shadow, recipient of the department's Valor Medal, the first non-human to ever receive it in that county. Kyle stood beside him, collar polished, uniform crisp. Emily watched from the front row, her feet swinging off the folding chair, clutching Peach the bunny in one hand. When Kyle stepped to the microphone, he paused, looking out at the crowd. "A few months ago," he began, "this dog stopped a woman at the courthouse doors. We thought it was a glitch, a growl, maybe a reaction to perfume, but what Shadow knew, what he sensed, saved a life." He turned to Shadow, then looked at Emily, and in doing so, he gave another one back. The crowd erupted in applause. Emily stood and clapped the loudest. That night, Kyle tucked Emily into bed. She was tired from the ceremony, but beaming. "Do I have to go back to the other place?" she asked sleepily. "Nope," he said softly. "Not if you don't want to." She snuggled into her pillow. "I want to stay here, with you, with him." Kyle smiled. "Then that's exactly what we'll do." Shadow curled up into the foot of the bed, ears flicking as the house settled around them. For once, there were no nightmares, just the sound of a child breathing safely in a home where she could finally sleep without fear. Weeks turned into months. Emily joined a group for kids who had been through trauma. Dana visited often, checking in, bringing books and puzzles. Shadow became a regular visitor at the courthouse, lying at the feet of scared children and easing tensions without a word. Kyle worked days, spent afternoons helping with homework, and learned how to braid hair, poorly, but with effort. And one afternoon, while walking through the park with Shadow on his left and Emily holding his right hand, she said, "You know, I think you were the one I was supposed to find." Kyle stopped. She looked up at him. "My real mommy told me to remember who I was. I think I found out when I met Shadow." Kyle's throat tightened. "I think you saved us too." They stood there a while longer, the breeze dancing around them. "Thank you for staying with us through this story. We believe that every child deserves to be protected, to be heard, and to be loved. And sometimes that protection comes from an unlikely hero with four paws and an unshakable sense of justice." What do you think Shadow sensed that no one else could? And do you believe canine dogs like him should be in every courthouse? Tell us in the comments below. We'd love to hear your thoughts.